What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over Air Combat Part 2. So in Air Combat Part 2, I just really want to cover launching enemies into the air, having them fall and go onto the ground, and then they can choose when to get up. Like, we'll have a timer that automatically makes them get up, but we'll also allow them to get up on their own, kind of like a delayed get up system. I've also made the hurt boxes visible, as you can see in this episode, just to kind of show you some different things that we'll need to adjust in the future. I may go over some basic concepts of how to adjust them, but we'll get into that deeper in another episode. Okay, so first of all, this is Air Combat Part 2. So if you want to specifically check out Air Combat Part 1, I'll leave a link to this iCard right here in the top right corner that brings you to the first part of Air Combat. We're going to fix some issues with gravity scaling that I didn't account for in episode 1. So your gravity scaling will be updated. Then when you hit your opponent, you'll be able to put them into a launching state where they get up on their own after 3 seconds, is what I put it to. And get up right away. Whoops. And then see, you can kind of see you get stuck because we no longer bounce off of each other in this state. So there are a few issues with this. But yeah, he can press up, essentially his jump key, to stand up when he's in the knockdown state. And like here, I shouldn't be able to hit him. We need to change the size of the hurt box. That's why I made it visible. And I can show you how to do that manually. But there's a few things we can do automatically to make our life a little bit easier, which we'll cover in a totally different episode. Hit the opponent, he goes flying in the air, and then if you continue to hit him, it is possible to keep hitting him. His gravity, I don't have any launch that like counteracts his gravity. He might do some weird stuff because he's in the knockdown state right now, and I can still hit him like this, and I should not be able to do that. But his gravity scale is actually increasing as we hit him. A good way to test this is to just, I'll show you, I'll grab my mutant character reference and print it out. Oops. So we'll get our modifier, which is getting multiplied to determine our gravity scale. Now the lower the gravity, remember, the slower he'll fall. The faster the gravity, the faster he'll fall. So if we had a longer combo where we could keep hitting him and launch was high enough that it could counteract that, then you'd really be able to see it. But since right now I'm just using my basic attack, let's just show you with the keys themselves. Okay, so you can see it's printing out already. The gravity scale is 0.7. Now as I hit this guy, he goes to a 0.8 gravity scale, meaning that he is falling faster. And that's good. But if we go ahead and hit him again, I'm going to get him over to the corner here. You'll be able to see he goes to 0.9. And then if he hits the ground, like you see when he hits the ground, then it resets, which is intended. Now, if I keep him here, I might be able to... Yeah, he's at a 1.0. So if I keep him at this magical spot where I can kind of lock him into place there. If I could keep hitting him... Regardless, my point is the gravity scale is now working. I was looking at the gravity scaling and realized that I was resetting it to the same value every time. So it was essentially every time you hit them, they would be set to a gravity scale of 0.7 or whatever you assigned it to, but it would not actually increase as you continue to hit them, which is not gravity scaling. It needs to continue to increase. Okay, so now that's done, we can go ahead and get into the code and take a look at what we're going to be doing today. So first things first, in fighter template character, I've added 2 new states, E knockdown and E recovery. I've also changed everything from VE to E just because it makes more sense to me. I was using VE because previously all the enums that I were using actually had to be called VE for a project I was working on, and it just got in my head. So the V isn't really important there, although it doesn't matter what you call it, you don't have to change it. However, I'm just trying to show you can change them all. And since we're making an enum change here, you might want to do it all at the same time. There is a way to make this process a little bit better. So as you guys are familiar with it, if you've been watching the series, if you haven't, by the way, and you'd like to catch up from the very beginning, I'll leave a link to the very first fighting game tutorial episode right here in this iCard. Regardless, what we want to do is we want to add 2 states. I added one for knockdown and recovery. The reason is, when we're knocked down, that's our on the ground state. There's certain things we want to be able to do then, and there's certain things we want to be able to do in recovery as well. Recovery is getting up. It can be anytime. You could use recovery after you were getting thrown. That recovery when you're standing back up, or even recovery when you're doing a throw and you're standing back up. Essentially, we can use this recovery state to block logic we don't want to do. But you might not want to keep it knocked down because you might want to be able to punish an opponent in the recovery state and not in the knockdown state or something to that effect. I've done quite a bit of changes in code, but they're not hard changes. Essentially, I've just done checks for every single state I don't want to be able to do things from. We were doing this in the tutorial, but I just wasn't doing it to the extent necessary to make this game flow. Now, you don't have to follow all of these, you can disagree, but this is how I'm setting mine up. So to be able to jump, my character has to be able to move, and their character state cannot be, does not equal, stunned, launched, knocked down, and recovery. Not ors, these are ands. Make sure it's none of those if we go to move, if we go to jump, excuse me. And then, before, I was just setting the character state to be jumping, and that works. I mean, obviously this works. We've been able to jump for a long time in this series. However, off of this if statement, I have an else if, and if the character state is equal to knocked down, and you try to do the jump command, then we want to bring them into recovery. Because we're pressing up, but we can't jump when we're knocked down, so we want to go to standing up. Now, there's a few other issues here. So in landed, this is what I was referring to with the gravity scale. We were resetting it to 0.7, but we didn't have another variable to keep track of it, so it was always being the same thing. So in your landed function, I now check if the character state is equal to jumping. I do this check that you don't really have to do, but it is useful. So the landed function essentially fires anytime that the bottom of the character is thought to have touched down on something and can stand on that. That means if the character lands on your hurt box, he can actually think that he's landed on top of you. So even if he were to fall, his gravity scaling could reset. Well, we don't want that to be the case. We don't want his gravity scaling to be reset because people can abuse that, and then it won't be good. Now, to be fair, we will be having the player not be able to stand on top of the other player. However, it's still a good safeguard just to not trigger landed if we're landing on a hitbox. Because it goes for the same thing. If you were to launch an attack and their bottom of their collider hits with that attack, we don't want them to think they've landed for any reason. So I've added some additional logic here, and it might seem a little bit confusing, but landed has a hit result. And hit is just, it's like in blueprints when you see on hit and things like that. It's saying this is the information from the object we hit. So you can use the hit variable, the hit parameter here, .actor, .get. So this will return the actor that we've collided with, and I do not, exclamation mark, not cast hitbox actor. Essentially saying if this actor cannot be casted to a hitbox actor, then we are not a type of hitbox or hurtbox. However, if this cast fails, then we're good to go. We know that we're not colliding with a hitbox or a hurtbox, and we'll probably touch the ground because the floors and the map should be level in this type of fighting game. Then we want to go ahead and get our character movement gravity scale and set that equal to our default gravity scale. So let's go over these new variables. I already had gravity scale in here from before. It's just going to be a float that I had. This is the default, I've called it default gravity scale. This is the variable I had before. It should just be called gravity scale for you, I believe, if you were following my naming conventions exactly. However, now, if we keep this variable, but then add gravity scale modifier, then that allows us to be able to change the amount of gravity scaling for each hit, as opposed to setting it to a specific value, which is a much better way to do it. Remember, if we're landing, we're resetting all of our gravity scaling values. So we set our gravity scale back to our default gravity scale. We reset our gravity scale modifier to whatever our default is. Could be different per character. Right now I'm just using 0.7 as the default. And then I'm setting our character state back to default, because if they landed and they were from jumping, then we want to set them to default. However, if we are landed and we're from launched, then our gravity scale should become knocked down. The other stuff is the same. We still want to set the gravity scale back to the default and still reset the gravity modifier, but their state is not default. If they're launched, we want them to go to knocked down. Now let me show you how I'm setting my gravity scale variable. Again, this is the same variable we had before, so I was already setting it, but here it is. Default gravity scale is equal to get character movement gravity scale. So this returns the gravity scale of the character, which you can change in like the blueprint, for example. If I go into my mutant character BP, go to my character movement component, gravity scale is 2.0 for this guy. So that's the value I'm getting here. I'm going to be getting 2.0 on this default gravity scale. And then the gravity scale modifier is 0.7. Alright, and then you can say I do the same thing for move right. I only allow the player to move right if they can move. They're not crouching, they're not blocking, they're not stunned, they're not knocked down, they're not recovering. Because when they're knocked down or when they're recovering, they shouldn't be able to move. You might be able to block as you're recovering or something to defend yourself. That's up to you. But moving looks bad if you're playing an animation that's static and not moving, and they're like halfway off the ground. You know, they're still in the crouch state. You don't want them to be able to walk fully. So either, you know, have the recovery state and don't have them be able to do certain things like move, or have them get up really quickly and just skip that step. Of course, I do the same thing for move right controller. It's the exact same if statement. Okay, so this is the important part for the gravity scaling in this episode. What we were doing prior was essentially grabbing the default gravity scale value and always setting it to the same value. We were essentially setting our gravity scale to whatever this was, or multiplying equals that value. But if it's always a constant value, then you're always going to get the same result. So instead, what we're doing now is we're setting our current gravity scale to our default gravity scale, and then multiplied by our gravity scale modifier. Now, you can do that. You know, there's a few ways you can do it to get the effect you want, but the important difference here is that I'm then increasing the gravity scale modifier. To increase this value is to change it every time this gets called. So if we're already launched and we get launched again, then our gravity scale modifier goes up, and thus our gravity scale is higher, and if our gravity scale is higher, we fall faster. So that is proper gravity scaling in terms of at least being able to scale the gravity. We weren't technically doing that, so we were never really doing gravity scaling, we were just changing the gravity scale. Hopefully that makes sense. With that, we should be good to go into the blueprints, excuse me. Now, the blueprints aren't too bad. The code actually was the majority of changes, although they were small changes. They were kind of all over the place. Now, in the blueprints, all I'm going to do is show you how to make the hurt box visible, which is quite simple, but just in case you want to play around with it and see kind of what it looks like, because I changed some of the scaling to get the knockdown animation looking right and things like that. So if you want to play around with it, all you have to do, this is where we're spawning our hurt box actor BP, which is in our character blueprint. And I cleaned it up a bit, so before I was calling set owner on this object like this. But since the owner is never going to change, there's no reason to not just grab a reference to self and put it in as the owner right here. For the record, it will be like this if you don't click this down arrow and nothing is connected to owner. So click the little down arrow, get a reference to self, and then drag that into owner just to clean it up a bit. Then I go ahead and make a hurtbox blueprint reference because we have a hurtbox actor object reference in our code class, and that's good, we need that. But if we want to change things like the size of our hurtbox we can go ahead and just change the static mesh component on a Hurtbox blueprint reference. I don't like having two variables, but for now, before we get into subclasses and things like that, it's just easier to do it this way. We'll probably merge this into one in a later episode when we're cleaning things up, and people who are familiar with those kind of things will be familiar with what I'm referring to. But for now, just drag off of your Hurtbox actor BP, promote it to a variable. I called mine Hurtbox BP reference. Still set your Hurtbox to this value. Still attach it to actor. And then lastly, I grab my blueprint reference, because this is the one with the mesh. I get my hitbox display, which is my static mesh component on my Hurtbox. And then I set visibility. And make sure I check it. New visibility is true. Okay, so that's simple enough. I kind of flew through that because we already had this. I was just trying to, kind of changing it. I mainly added this so that we could change the Hurtbox size and also set its visibility. But honestly, you don't need any of that for this episode. It's just something I did to make it a little bit easier to understand what was going on. Alright, and then lastly guys, let's go to our animation blueprint for our character. In this one, here's my logic. So I went ahead and added some new states. We did have our launch state from before. And our launch state was just this. Our character was getting launched, and then he was sticking at like this end frame here until he touched the ground. Then he was going back to idle. Now that was okay, but again, we want him to be able to get knocked down now if he's been launched and has no way to recover. So if we go ahead and look at our state machine now, I have launched, and I do have him being able to return to idle. However, he will never take this transition at the current time. You can probably get rid of it. I did leave it in just in case you want to ever have them go from launch to idle. There are characters in fighting games that have recoveries that you can be launched, recover, and then go to idle. So you might want to do some logic to do that. For now, we're going to have launched to a new state called knockdown, and then I have knockdown idle. So launch to knockdown is when the character collides with the ground. He goes from his launched animation to his falling on the ground animation. Knockdown to idle, or knockdown to knockdown idle, is when he's on the ground and you can choose to get up, or he automatically gets up after 3 seconds. And then I go to knockdown recovery, which is actually my throw recovery from my throw episode, because it's the same animation that works here. And then that logic automatically brings us to idle. You can feel free to make a new state. I just use knockdown recovery as the throw recovery. The reason I'm using the same state is because, again, they're going to be playing the same animation. The last thing that you need to know before we get into the new stuff is just that in the states to get to launch now, I don't just get to launched from idle just by checking if the character state is launched. You can go from any of the jumping states to launched. And the way I go from them, I have a shared transition that I made called launched. So it's pretty simple. But essentially what it is just if the character state is stunned or launched in the air, then we know that they should go to the launch state. So the character gets put in the launch state if the enemy that hits them has launch on their attack that they're using, right? But if you're already in the air and you just take a hit, you should just get put into the launch state and then get knocked down when you hit the ground. Is, you know, like an anti-air attack. You got countered, essentially. I have that from my forward jump, my end jump, start jump, and backward jump. You could even add this from your jump attacks. I did not, just because I'm trying to keep this graph as nice as possible for you guys so you can still see what's going on. But you probably should be able to go from these attacks to launch as well. Regardless, as I said, the rules are essentially that the character is either stunned or launched from this state. We'll go into our launched animation. Now, launch to knockdown. Let's cover this one. Okay, so launch to knockdown. What we've got going on here is we just check our character state to see if it's knocked down. So if we're in the launched animation and it's knocked down, we automatically go to knockdown. This is important because our logic to return from launched is to make sure that the character is no longer launched. Well, if we set it to knockdown, then our character state sure isn't launched anymore. And because of that, we need to make sure if we have our launch to idle state still in the game, that we need to make the transition rule from launch to idle is that the character state is not launched or knocked down. Because if it's knocked down, we want to go here. Okay? So, if we're knocked down, go to the knockdown state. Simple enough. I'm applying root motion on this animation, so you can see it a little bit when we hit the ground. But this is it. He just falls over. No anim notifies or anything. Mainly just a visual thing to make it look nice. And no transition events or anything like that. So literally just a state that plays an animation. Now, knockdown idle. Remember, this is the animation. Well, this is the part where the character can choose to get up on their own, or it makes them get up after 3 seconds. For this, I don't have a transition rule because I just wanted to automatically go to this when the knockdown state is done. You do want a transition event. Specifically, I put on start transition event for knockdown idle. Knockdown to knockdown idle. And what we're going to do is start our get up timer, is what I'm calling it. We're not going to go over the logic until we're done with the state machine, but go ahead and add the event now. Knockdown idle to knockdown recovery. We want to make sure that we have this event called invalidate get up timer. The reason I'm doing this, the get up timer is essentially how long you have to press up, or whatever button you're defining as the button, to be able to stand up. And for me, it's just the jump key. Whatever I use on the controller or the keyboard to jump is my key to get up. If I don't get up after 3 seconds, I force the character to get up. But if we're returning from knockdown idle to knockdown recovery is just the mutant getting up animation. So we know he's standing up if he's entering this state, and thus we no longer need to force him to get up. So again, that's why I have this event invalidate get up timer. It's no longer relevant. We don't want it. Lastly, knockdown recovery to idle, I have end get up logic. Now, even if you're doing it as the same animation and same state as the throw, like I am, you can still keep this. It won't hurt anything because the reference will be invalid. You'll see that later when we get into the event graph. So don't worry about screwing anything up. However, feel free to make a new event and keep this one throw recovery and make another one knockdown recovery. That way you're only passing the one transition event when you go from that state back to idle. Also important to note that it is automatic rule-based because there's no reason to have any state. We're just having the animation play so that the character can go from the knockdown to idle animation. Lastly, we just have to fill out these transition events, which is pretty simple. So remember, when you make these transition event rules, you can just go ahead and call them at any point you want. So the way you do it is you take your anim notify, like we have one called start get up timer, and you would grab the event, and then grab invalidate get up timer, and then lastly grab end get up timer logic, or get up logic. There we go. And we have three events now, and then we're going to make a new one here in a second. Let's start with the start get up timer. What we're doing here is we can determine, based on the state we're in, how long we want to keep the player on the ground. So start get up timer fires once the character gets into their knockdown idle state. And what I do is I set a timer by event. You can just right click, set timer by event, and what it does is it will call event once a certain amount of time has passed. So I go ahead and put in 3 seconds for my time, and then you can drag off the event here and add custom event. Click this. I called mine force get up. Okay, you don't need to change anything else here. Now, if 3 seconds passes, that means this event's logic will get called. So in force get up, all I do is do the transition rule to make sure that the character goes from knockdown idle to recovery. And for us, that rule is just that the character state is equal to recovery. So I grab the mutant character reference and I set their character state to recovery. Simple enough. Now remember, we can also go to recovery if we try to perform the jump function while we're knocked down. Remember this at the start of the episode? Jump. Else, if character state is equal to knocked down, then we enter recovery. So either by pressing up or by waiting 3 seconds, we'll get into the recovery state, which will allow us to go into that recovery animation. Now, we have an event on this transition called invalidate GetUp timer. So invalidate GetUp timer, it just calls this one function called clear and invalidate timer by handle. This guy right here. And then I pass in the timer that I set in start GetUp timer. You see that? The blue line is the handle. What this does is it essentially clears the timer that is set and ticking and deletes it so that the logic that would occur does not occur. The reason we want this is, okay, so say our time is 3 seconds. We get up instantly, and our recovery animation is not 3 seconds long. Then we start moving. Well, in 3 seconds, we don't want to put our character into the recovery state. That'll be weird logic. It could screw up our attacks or other things. So essentially, if we do this animation, we want to clear and get rid of our timer. We no longer need this timer to be going. Okay. Lastly, we need our end GetUp logic. So the reason I have this end GetUp logic is because when you're recovering, right here. Remember, we get to this state by having our character state in the recovery enum. Well, if we're recovering, great, we're doing this animation, but we don't want to be able to walk here. Like, he's trying to stand up. If we're moving left or right or jumping during this state, it would look weird. So instead of changing it from recovery to idle or whatever state, once we enter this animation, what I do is on the end transition event, we have end GetUp logic. That means once we have entered the idle state, essentially. Once this transition has been taken and we're back in idle, then call this event. So once we've returned to idle, then we want to set our state to not moving. We want to do that tiny little delay just to make sure that we don't have any weird logic there where we can move before we're supposed to. And that's pretty much it, guys. I do have some logic to modify hurt boxes, which is part of the reason I had it visible today. However, in the next episode, we're going to be able to get into a lot more and why it's important. So I'll just leave these here. You can kind of see what I'm doing. And we'll cover that in the next one. I think this is enough for one episode, and I think it's all relevant. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching this episode. I hope it helped you with air combat, specifically gravity scaling and getting knocked down and recovering from getting knocked down. You can use that knockdown logic anywhere you want, and it should work just as long as you are setting the character to the right state. And yeah, it looks pretty good while we're at it, too. So, cool little effect there. And not every attack will do this, of course. Only attacks that set the character to be launched. So I can still just jab at them like this, and that's good to go. If you enjoyed and this did help you, please subscribe. It does more for the channel than anything else, and it just lets me know I'm doing a good job. I really appreciate it. It encourages me to continue working on this series. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters. I just really appreciate the support you're giving me, and thank you so much for continuing to believe in this series. If you did have any issues with this episode or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord. I will be happy to help and assist with anything that I can. We have a great, loving community. Lastly, guys, if you want to come support us on Twitch, twitch.tv/Shawnthebro27, we will be starting programming streams this Friday or next Friday. We'll be trying that out. So we are still going to be doing the Dark Souls streams. So every Wednesday, we'll be doing Dark Souls streams, and on Friday, we'll do programming streams and maybe just make some fun stuff. So I'm pretty excited for that. I'm hoping you guys enjoy it as well. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.